If previous pandemics are anything to go by, then this COVID-19 pandemic will soon morph into an endemic, hopefully moderated by the effectiveness of any vaccines that might appear and perhaps controlled by one or more of the pharmaceutical products, notably something like remdesivir, or rather than the somewhat bizarre anti-malarial hydroxychloroquine favoured by President Trump. Very few diseases are actually ever finally eliminated, and in living memory, only smallpox has come close to extinction. But even this, thanks to some third world reluctance to accept the vaccine, is still at large. And if microbial bacteria are difficult to control, how much more difficult are viruses? And given the rise in urban population densities, experiences with such as MERS, SARS, and particularly HIV, they all strongly suggest that global populations will have to adapt and accommodate these and other new viral threats in the years, decades, and maybe even centuries that are to come. So we're going to have to accommodate. But this will result not in just a physical change, but a cultural and especially a psychological one as well. For the 2020s generations, of course, COVID seems like an act of God, the arrival of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, impossible to fight, and yet with such a devastating, even cataclysmic consequences. But of course, this is clearly not so. The world will certainly not end, and indeed, on a global scale of disasters, and for all its current shutdowns, lock-ins, and economic collapse, this current calamity is relatively minor. At the time of writing, some 350,000 people have died, while approximately 1.9 million victims have actually survived. And even if the death toll were to rise to 1 million, that still hardly compares with a world war. About 20 million died in World War I and some 60 million in World War II. And our current COVID mortality level, and indeed both the two figures I've just mentioned in these wars, are dwarfed in turn by the approximately 100 to 150 million that died from the so-called Spanish flu that wrought such far-sprung changes in the wake of World War I, and whose strategic consequences still affect us today. Of course, don't get me wrong, I don't seek to underestimate the effect of COVID, or in any way dismiss the personal tragedy that follows the loss of a loved one. But as a military and international historian, it's my duty to set the currently perceived cataclysm into context. And just as in past pandemics, the consequences of this pandemic will be far more strategic than the medical records suggest. So we must expect similar strategic transformation. And we should recall that virtually all the consequential changes were not only seismic, but they were also unanticipated, which each producing not just losers, but winners as well. Now, in the Western world, there's a saying, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And this Darwinian thought rather echoes the German word Schadenfreude, or to put it more explicitly, one person's misfortune is another's opportunity. And it's perhaps this wave of opportunism that arises in the wake of a disaster that we ought to be considering now. So I guess our task at this conference is to scan the global horizon to see who has been disadvantaged, physically, culturally, economically, but especially psychologically from the events of 2020, while at the same time, we should assess who, what nations, which movements are well placed to take advantage. So the world's going to change, almost certainly, in ways that none of us foresee. But nevertheless, what are the geostrategic changes that are taking place and are in the context for this unexpected turn of events? Well, one at least is fairly easy, and that is the competition right now for top dog. As Carl Bildt said in a recent tweet about a meeting of the WHO, the USA is increasingly behaving like a petulant child, whilst China seems to appear restrained, measured, mature. He notes that as one superpower declines, another establishes itself. But such changes are rarely achieved peacefully, though in this case, the confrontation is less likely to be about military might, but more about subtle, nuanced, and coercive measures. And let's not forget that China's culture, its mores, language, and attitudes are very different and somewhat anathema to European civilization. our civilization with its Judeo-Christian ethics and echoes of chivalry. So while we in the West think we are playing a game of poker, the Chinese are outsmarting us at chess. But of what we can determine of Chinese strategy, it does appear that she is pursuing a two-pronged foreign policy approach. Assertive and forceful at home, or at least in what she considers to be her home, but strong, yet beneficent and helpful abroad. You might find this surprisingly, but China's militant approach within her self-generated 9-dash line has been as intensive during the COVID crisis as ever it was. On the 2nd of April, a Vietnamese trawler was rammed and sunk. In mid-February, at the height of the Wuhan pandemic, a Philippine warship was tracked and threatened by a radar-laid gun. And since mid-April, a Chinese research vessel has been conducting a seabed survey flagrantly inside Malaysia's exclusive economic zone. And similarly, while the West has been focusing on the pandemic, Beijing has taken the opportunity to arrest agitators in Hong Kong and is now making major and far-reaching changes to the territory's law. But in contrast, on the world stage, China seeks to appear peaceful and benign and to expand its influence. China was determined to be seen to providing emergency medical supplies to Italy, Belgium, France, Czech Republic and Spain at the height of the epidemic. And now, of course, it's widening its span to include Africa, no doubt South America in turn. But already, her Belt and Road Initiative fosters links to Russia across a Eurasian land bridge, via the old Silk Road along the Central and West Asia corridor all the way to Istanbul, and its so-called maritime Silk Road routes pass down the South China Sea, through the Straits of Malacca, across to Sri Lanka, across to East Africa, through Suez, across the Aegean, and even up the Adriatic to the very outskirts of Venice itself. But these are not just trade routes, these are also avenues of strategic investment. Chinese foreign direct investment in Europe has increased by almost 50 times in only 8 years, from less than 840 million in 2008 to a record high of 42 billion in 2016. And it becomes interesting when you start to think which areas have been targeted. China Reform's recent attempted takeover of the UK high-tech firm Imagination, for example, is part of a major Chinese acquisition spree in Europe and North America over the last few years. Just last year, Chinese entities invested 11.7 billion euros in European Union countries, the vast majority in mergers and acquisitions. In Britain, China already has a controlling stake in Scotland's only oil refinery at Grangemouth. It seeks to use Huawei to control the UK's 5G network and still has plans to develop Britain's next generation of nuclear power stations. Beijing has also shown a strong interest in European airports, with a 9.5% share in London's Heathrow, but a 49.9% share in Toulouse in 2014, and an 82% share of Hahn Airport near Frankfurt. It also holds controlling stakes in the airports of Tirana, Albania, and Ljubljana in Slovenia. And such strategic penetration is mirrored in other countries, such as Italy, where some 29 deals have now been signed, including the purchase of Pirelli, as well as projected investments of up to 7 billion euros in the Italian ports of Genoa and Trieste. In cash-strapped Greece, too, the Chinese state-owned enterprise giant Costco has acquired a 67% stake in the port of Piraeus, which is Europe's largest passenger port. With Piraeus now considered China's gateway into Europe, shipping times for Chinese goods have been shortened by a week, and China intends to use Piraeus as its main platform for its maritime Silk Road. Of course, such foreign direct investment should in the normal course of global trading be welcomed. But the problem is that Chinese investment has an ulterior motive. China's interests are not only economic, but political, and signs of this influence are beginning to show. For example, in 2017, Greece was persuaded to veto a European Union statement at the United Nations expressing condemnation of China's human rights. Many European countries, still not fully recovered from the Eurozone crisis, have looked positively on the Chinese investments as a source of welcome financial capital and a subsequent means of growth, tax revenue, employment, infrastructure development, and market opportunities. But only in the last few years have some concerns emerged as European capitals are struggling to find the right balance between the core principles of economic openness versus security concerns relating to the growing Chinese footprint. And of course, just to the south of Europe, China is now Africa's largest commercial partner and largest exporter, and that to a continent where so many essential mineral resources lie. It is notably ahead of the former colonial powers Britain and France in both of the categories in Africa. And while, of course, China may be unable to control the world's oil supply, it's progressively establishing a stranglehold on a number of essential raw materials, such as cobalt. And it is the major supplier of critical raw materials, accounting for 70% of their global supply and 62% of their supply to the EU of rare earth elements such as magnesium, antimony, and natural graphite. And there is yet another post-pandemic aspect still waiting in the wings that we must be aware of, and that is debt. Some analysts talk about a mountain of debt, but mountains are immovable and you can scale a mountain. Rather, I suggest a better concept is an ocean of depth, whose depths are almost unknown, whose level is rising inexorably, and whose storms and tsunamis cause such devastation when they hit us. In the wake of COVID, virtually all governments have paid the wages and funded companies who have been unable to work because of the social distancing and lockdown policies. The depth of such debt is now of staggering proportions, and chancellors are seeking ways to manage and service this debt through increased borrowing from a willing China, of course, amongst others, and of course by printing money. If interest rates can be held low, and if inflation kept in check, many countries will manage, but others will not. So what does all this context mean for the Eastern Mediterranean? Of course, much will depend not just on Chinese empire building, but in the short term, equally, if not more, on the forthcoming US presidential election this November. And this in turn will likely hinge on the perception of Trump's success in combating COVID, or equally importantly, in offloading the blame for it on China, or indeed anyone else he can scapegoat. But if the great US public see through his antics and actually elect Biden, then maybe, just maybe, we might slowly return to a more normal world of the 1990s or early 2000s. However, if past presidential elections are anything to go by, we should expect Donald Trump to be re-elected, but this time on a platform of anti-Chinese rhetoric and hysteria. With the political scene set in the next 4 years for increased US-Chinese antipathy, leading perhaps to confrontations, maybe deniable skirmishes, a resurgent North Korea, and even small-scale surrogate conflicts. This is probably the scenario that Xi Jinping probably fears most, but equally likely it's the one he is most prepared for. China probably will go all out to win the popularity contest. But of course, we need to realize in China there's no such thing as a hard fact. Everything is political, and that means being molded for best effect. And as the FT reported recently, on the same day that the spokesman for China's foreign ministry suggested that the US military could have actually brought the COVID virus into Wuhan, China actually posted a second video of Italians applauding China from their balconies. And it said something like, "In Rome, with the Chinese anthem playing, some Italians chanted Grazie Cina on their balconies, and their neighbors applauded all along." Clearly, this is a sort of propaganda that resonates well, both with the internal Chinese population and also with many other countries where China hopes to gain influence. However, if Mr. Trump does become more overtly hostile after the election, expect the Chinese relationship with Russia to deepen rather further, supporting and affording Mr. Putin a free hand in Syria, the Middle East, and certainly in his dealings with Turkey. But China, of course, won't have it all her own way, as the issue of responsibility for the pandemic is still an open question. As the FT noted recently, politicians as far apart as Australia, India, Europe, and Brazil have pinned the blame for the rapid spread of the pandemic on Mr. Xi's administration. And any call for an international inquiry will inevitably lead to counters by China. Australia, for example, has already had an 80% tariff slapped on its beef exports to China, and this will no doubt be accompanied by what some have termed a global disinformation campaign. The communist government made protests recently after details emerged of an internal EU report, that pointed to evidence of Beijing using both overt and covert tactics in a global disinformation campaign to avoid blame for the pandemic. The diplomatic pressure highlights China's strong pushback against accusations from Europe that it is attempting to use a health emergency to sow division and make strategic gains. So the Allies may have to choose which side to support, US on the one hand or Trump on the other. But if confrontation does intensify, then the world will likely move on to what many analysts have already called a new Cold War between the US and its partners on the one hand, and China, Russia, and its adherents on the other. However, whether such a Cold War will be pursued by Mr. Trump with all the vim and vigor of the last Cold War, I have my doubts. And I suggest that much posturing and rhetoric will be largely for US internal consumption. So let's just assume Mr. Trump is indeed re-elected. What then will he seek as his legacy in his second and final term? Well, if his first term is anything to go by, we've got to anticipate whimsy, unpredictability, a continuing sneaking respect for dictators, an ambivalence towards his allies, a dislike of international institutions such as the UN, a rejection of any arms control, and an inability to see anything except the most blindingly obvious. Such traits, I suggest, are not those of a strategic globalist, the world's policeman, a man of peace and coexistence. Rather, they speak of an insecure man, a showman, one desiring instant success and adulation at home, whilst largely indifferent to the affairs in unimportant and remote parts of the globe. If he does become fixated on China across the Pacific, by pandering to xenophobic nationalism, then such a focus will become a new form of international blindness elsewhere, a sort of isolationism comparable to the 1920s and 1930s. And perhaps for the Eastern Mediterranean, it leaves us with the saying, when the cat's away, the mice will play. Well then, what might happen if a different cat arrives? Thank you.